Contact is cloudy. It's weird. It's like one eye's fine, the other eye doesn't.
Put some stuff in.
I don't have any stuff on me.
Somebody in your church has got some contacts.
That's not the funniest solution to the problem. We'll do something. Oh, yeah, do it right now. All right, how we got the Bible. That's what we were talking about. And specifically last week, we started a study about the English Bible in particular. We've looked in the last few weeks before that, some evidence. How can we be sure? And that's really why we're studying this. We want to be sure. We want to be sure that what we're modeling our lives after is truly from God. And how can we know? And the reason we do this is because there are individuals out there, there's academics and scholars out there who are telling people that you cannot trust your Bible. And that's an issue. That's a problem. Because these are men who are teaching other men who are standing in the pulpit, and now even within the church, this isn't a them problem, it's an us problem. Because even individuals in the church are hearing from pulpits across our brotherhood that we can't trust our Bibles. And I hope from those first 2 weeks that you can just, even though we're doing this as an overview and kind of just a quick glance at some of the scholarship that's available and some of the background to these things, I hope you're seeing that, oh yeah, we can absolutely trust our English Bibles. And so last week we began to look at how we got the English Bible, along with some tying up things. You know, there's always things that you got to tie up, right? And so we want to tie up some things tonight regarding our English Bibles, because throughout the history, we started off, if you remember, Tyndale. And who remembers, I'm almost scared to ask about last week, who remembers who Tyndale was? Why is he so important in regard to the English Bible's history? Right. He was the first one. He was the first one to translate the Bible from the original language into English and then have the Bible printed on the Gutenberg press. And he was lauded worldwide, famous. His face was the original face on Mount Rushmore, right? What did he get for all of his work? Who remembers? Yeah, he was burned at the stake. And so this isn't just an academic story or an academic history. This was life or death. And that seems strange to us because how many English Bibles are there in print now? Agnes, you know. No, you don't know. I'm just kidding. Wilda won't let me pick on her anymore. On threat of violence, so I got to pick on you now. No, there's a lot, right? We probably have multiple copies in our homes. And you go to the bookstore, you go to Books A Million, and there you have about 100 Stephen Kings and Dean Koontz and John Grishams, and then about 100 Bibles on the other side, right? And so they're everywhere. But there was a time, and it wasn't that long ago. That's what's crazy. It wasn't that long ago. The late 1400s, really, in the whole scheme of things, wasn't that long ago. And there was a time that the English Bible didn't even exist. And so we looked at that, and I hope you see the importance, and we kind of sped through up until the 1600s, because that was when the next big thing happened. And what was that? The Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible, and that Bible stood for about a century as being the go-to. They loved their Geneva Bible. Why was it called the Geneva Bible? Because it was done in Geneva. Bloody Mary. Remember Mary, Bloody Mary, Henry VIII's daughter who took over, hated the Protestants. because she blamed the Protestants for her mother's murder. If you remember, the Church of England came about because Henry VIII was not given a divorce by the Pope, and so he divorced her, then later he killed her. But because of all that, the Church of England was established, and she hated Protestantism. And so she was killing the Puritans within England, and a group of Puritans left, escaped, refugees, to Switzerland, to Geneva, and there they did their own English. And what was important about that is that it was the first to have the verses and the chapters in the Bible. It was also the first to be a study Bible. We like our study Bibles with all the notes and references and all that. They had all of that in there. And the Church of England hated it. They hated it. They had it banned. When there would be shipments come in, they would burn them. And it was because they felt that it threatened the monarchy. And it threatened their power. So then we flash forward a little bit to James. James I. He was King James VI in Scotland, and then when Elizabeth died in 1603, he took over. He was King James I. And he decided that he was going to heal the rift between the Puritans and the bishops of the Anglican Church, and they were going to do the, capital T-H-E, the English Bible, and we know it as the King James. And so that's where we're going to pick up tonight. We're going to not spend a whole lot of time in this story of what was happening, what was going on, but I do want to finish it up because there are some other key events, and this is what we're trying to get. We're just trying to get the key events. Okay, so the 1611, and we mentioned this last week as well, but just to reiterate, anybody use the King James? Okay, a couple. We always call it the 1611 King James, right? You have the 1789 King James. Because the 1611 King James would be unreadable to us. Middle English is, if you ever see at the library at the School of Preaching, they actually have replicas of these original type versions and what they would look like. And if you ever see a page, first of all, they're beautiful because they really fancied it up when they would print them. It was an artistic thing. So they're very, very beautiful, but the language, you can make out about 60% of it. It's crazy how Old English looks. And so we wouldn't have even been able to read it. And the reason it's 1780, 89 is because it's the 9th revision is what we have. And so they would periodically update it and correct things. And that caused some really wacky stuff. That caused the Murderer's Bible to come out, where the printer made a mistake. And in the 10 Commandments in Exodus, he said, "Thou shalt murder," because he left the not out. And so you have the Murderer's Bible, you have the Sinner's Bible, which encourages, again, they always mess up on the 10 Commandments for some reason, but it encourages the adultery and having affairs with your neighbor's wife through a printing error. So there were some issues there, but then finally in 1789. And then it kind of stopped and died down for a while. And that was probably because of modernism coming in, the Age of Reason. And the idea in scholarship to get away from what they termed the mythology. That's not a word. What's the word? The mythology of the Bible, to get rid of the supernatural of the Bible. And that's where scholarship went, because we're in the age of science, we're in the age of reason. Darwin's coming on the scene and all of these things. And so biblical scholarship was still happening, but biblical revisions kind of stopped. Until about the mid-1800s, and two men decided, they were seeing all of these archaeological discoveries. Now, who remember how many manuscripts was the King James based on? The Textus Receptus, the Greek from which the Greek text from which the Bible was translated, was based on how many manuscripts? Who remembers? Y'all are really depressing me. I'm going to go home and cry that I'm not able to teach this. 25. 25 manuscripts. And who remembers how many we have today? 25,700, but you were close. So archaeology blew up in the 1800s. And they were finding these biblical relics and biblical manuscripts and pieces of manuscripts all over the place. And some were dating back way earlier than the 25 that were used in the Textus Receptus. And so they're gathering up all of these things. And two men realized something. We need a new Bible. We have a Bible that's based on 25 manuscripts, but we have all of these other witnesses over here. And we need to incorporate those as well. And these two men devised a way to not just take the evidence from the 25, which did a wonderful job, but to also bring in these thousands that they kept finding. And not to mention scholarship in the ancient and dead languages kept growing as well. And so these two men, their names were Westcott and Hort, they got together and they compiled a new Greek text that would replace the Textus Receptus, or the received text that the King James was based on. And their plan was to then encourage and do a new version of the Bible. Now, do you think, just guessing, do you think that idea went over well, or do you think they hit some speed bumps there? What do you think? Oh, they were hated. They're still hated. You really want to know what they were up against? Go onto your interwebs and go to Google and type in Westcott Hort King James Only. And you'll get hundreds of websites up from the King James Only crowd who believe that Paul carried a leather-bound goatskin King James under his arm to all those missionary journeys. And they hate these two guys. And they will slander and all this misrepresentation and misinformation. It's really ridiculous. But the scholarly community was like, let's do it. The religious community, no. Don't. Would you say that humanity likes change? No. And when it comes to something that's close to our heart, do we like change? No, not at all. And so they were really facing a fight, but they did. They collected, and in collecting and forming this new Greek text, the Westcott Hort text, they also gave us the principles for textual criticism that we talked about. And they're really kind of known as the fathers of that, even though some of the things that they said really isn't taken seriously anymore. Some of those principles are. But what they showed was we need, as we're getting the new witnesses in and we're finding all of these new manuscripts, we need to be using them and incorporating them. And we need to be honest about it. If our desire, and our desire should be to get a Greek text that's closest to the original as possible. And from that Greek text, then get a translation that's as close to the original as possible. That should be our desire of every honest Bible student. And that was the desire of Westcott and Hort. And so they came up with this Westcott Hort text, and it was then translated. And by the way, the Westcott and Hort text is no longer used today because it's out of date. Because since the mid 1800s, we found a whole lot more. And so we'll get to that in a minute. Okay. So their text came out, but it wasn't the King James. It didn't go over well. And so a group of Greek scholars in England decided we need to update it. We need to update it seriously. We'll do it similar to how they did the King James. We're going to get a whole bunch of committees together and go out and we'll do separate parts. And they have all of these things. And so they started in the late 1800s. And then as they were finishing, they said, we should see what the colonists say. Because in 1611, there wasn't no America. And so they decided, well, they're part of the English-speaking world. Let's see what they say. And so they sent their work to a group of Americans, and the Americans formed a committee. And the Americans would look at it, and they would study it, and they would say, well, and they made about 900 suggestions. And the Brits looked at that and said, ha, 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 silly colonists. I tell you what we'll do. We'll take 400 of these, and we'll make them footnotes so the silly Americans will feel okay and good. And so in 1881, the Revised Standard came out in England. Now, the American scholars decided they're going to break away. They're not paying attention to us. They don't talk like we talk. And so we're going to just do our own. And the Brits said, no, 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 no. Because within the contract, they had to wait 17 years before they could publish the American version of the Revised Version. And so in 1901, the American Standard comes out. Now, the American Standard was considered very, very good. It was considered to be a standard, and it held up that way for the longest time. One of the problems with the American Standard, it cleaned up a lot of the archaic language and the language and words that had changed meanings over the last few centuries of the King James, but it was very stilted. Anybody use the American Standard today? Here? Anybody here? No, not the New American Standard. That's different. No, just the American Standard. If you've ever used it or read it, it feels stilted. It doesn't read very smoothly. And that's kind of an opinion thing, but it really doesn't. It just doesn't read smoothly. And neither does the Revised Standard, but both are really good translations. Really, really good translations. And so in 1901, we get the American Standard. Okay, let's stop and talk about, we were talking about the readability. How important is the readability of a Bible? You would think very, right? Have you ever tried to, show of hands, who likes to sit at night in bed and read? Read to just kind of relax? No. Okay, 1. Seriously? Okay, 2. Who likes to play video games? There's 1. Now, I knew that was going. 2, okay. Netflix. Evening news. Agnes. Jimmy Fallon. No one? Yeah, you know, if Johnny Carson was still alive, you'd be there. Okay. All right. Anyway. All right. What kind of books do we tend to like to read for fun? Fiction, maybe historical biographies, that kind of thing, right? Would you ever just read a textbook for fun? Agnes just gave me an eye roll. We don't, right? Because it's not really readable. Fiction is written so we can fly through it as entertainment, right? Historical biographies and stuff give us information, but it's also written. It also needs, if it's going to be popular, to be readable. If it's not readable, what do? I'm not going to waste our time with it. It's too much effort. So we want Bibles that are readable, right? But what about accurate? Do we need Bibles that are accurate? Absolutely, right? But we want Bibles then that are accurate, but very readable. What about trying to think of a good adjective. Do we want our Bibles to sound pretty? To have kind of a ring of majesty to them? That's not the right word. I'm not even describing it correctly. Nevertheless, when we're talking about translation, we're talking about a balance, essentially. There's about 4 points that the translating committees want to get to when they're doing translations, but we're really ultimately talking about a balance of 2 things. You want it accurate. If it's not accurate, how good is it? You know. But you also want it readable, because if the people can't read it, guess what? They're not going to. So a balance has to be drawn. And so translators tend to always seem to try to make that compromise between readability and accuracy. Now, which is more important?
Accuracy.
How many say accuracy? Okay. How many say readability? Anybody? No one raised their hands to that. In the translating community, there's a fight that's always going on between readability and accuracy. And I agree with you and most all of y'all that accuracy is king. A Bible is useless if it's not accurate to the original text, right? But it's got to be readable as well. And so the reason I say that is because you have these 2 mindsets among translators that have affected the history of our English Bible. And that's one mindset that says it's got to be word for word. Have you heard that term, word for word translation? It needs to be a word for word translation. But then over here, you have a mindset, well, word for word doesn't really work as well as we would like, and so they do readable translations. We call them paraphrases. What does it mean when you paraphrase something?
You get the idea across, but not verbatim.
Right. You're not looking for a word-for-word translation. Instead, you're anticipating or trying to get what the original author was trying to say, and then you put it in your own words. You're paraphrasing. And so here's this big spectrum, right? You have the paraphrase over here, and then you have those that are striving for word-to-word accuracy over here. And what does that do with us as we look for a Bible to study from and a Bible to use and a Bible to what does that do for us? Kind of causes a little bit of confusion, right? Because the serious Bible student wants one that's very, very accurate, and word for word, as we like to say. And we don't want to make the mistake of picking up something that's paraphrased. What's the issue over here with the paraphrasing? It makes us dependent on their interpretation, right? Instead of being able to read for ourselves and see what God is saying, and us do the job of exegeting, that is pulling out the message and interpreting the Bible, they're doing it for us. Is there danger in that? You better believe it. You better believe it. And so that causes the question, well, which Bible should I use? Which Bible should I use? I don't know how many times I've been asked that question. It's a lot. I can tell you that, because we're worried about it. And honestly, we should be to an extent. So which Bible? So again, as we kind of sum up just the end of this kind of short history, really, I've been talking that long. Okay, for this kind of short history, let's kind of look at some of our modern versions, and I want you, before we get to this, I know I'm kind of all over the place tonight, but before we get to this, I want you to listen to 2 quotes. Okay, 2 quotes by very, very respected individuals. The first comes from the preface to the King James. I made note of the preface to the King James because this is just an amazing thing. I think everybody should read the preface to the King James. And the sad thing is, the majority of our King James Bibles today, they don't print the preface anymore. And they should. But this is the mentality of the King James translators in the preface. This is the original preface. It was entitled "The Translators to the Reader." And it was in the original 1611 and then taken through. But this is what they had to say. "If anything be halting or superfluous or not so agreeable to the original text, the same may be corrected and the truth set in place." Now, to bring that in, what they're saying is they never intended the King James Version to be the absolute. They never intended the King James Version to be an end. It was always to be a work in progress as new things came to light, as new study and knowledge of those older languages came to light, as new manuscripts came to light. It was always to be changing, to incorporate the new knowledge that we get. Why? Because they wanted a Bible that was as close to the original writings as possible. Now, that mentality versus the King James only crowd, do you see a difference there? There's an absolute difference in mentality there. And that shows a very, very honest view of where they were, right? They were very honest individuals. They were very honest in their handling of God's Word. The second quote I want to share with you is from J.W. McGarvey. Anybody ever hear of J.W. McGarvey? It's a preacher from the late 1800s. This quote comes from the lecture that he gave in 1883. He was a gospel preacher. This is what he said. In all of our study, and this is about actually the new revised version, or the revised version that came out in 1881, 2 years before. But he says, in all our study of the Scriptures, we must constantly consult the original if we can, and that we must by all means use the best version. The revised version of 81 is what he's talking about. Of the New Testament should now totally supplant the King James, not only because it is a great improvement as a version, but because it is the only representative in English of the corrected Greek text. A man is not safe in venturing upon the exegesis of a single passage by the aid of the old version until he shall have compared it carefully with the new. So, okay, getting back to the question, and again, knowing that some are going to be word for word, that some are going to be paraphrases, and most are somewhere here in the middle. What English text do we use? What English Bible? And this is the question so many people have. What English translation do I need to use today? Because that's going to affect a lot. Anybody ever hear of I think it's called the Cabbage Patch version? This is a thing. The Cabbage Patch version, or is it the Green Patch? I think it's the Cabbage Patch version. This is a paraphrased version. It introduces Jesus as being born not in Bethlehem, but in Alabama. He rides into Jerusalem, which now is somehow in Alabama, on a John Deere. This is a serious version of the Bible written for rural America. Which not only is it a paraphrase, and I would consider blasphemous, and this is an extreme paraphrase. You can't even consider that a Bible. So what do? We don't want to end up with that. I don't think anybody with 2 cents, and I'm not talking about pennies, would even consider that a new Bible. It's almost written as a parody of one, but it's a thing. So what do? So let's just take some time and look at what's out there today. I figure that's a good way to end the last 15 minutes. Let's just see what's out there today, and we can make up our own minds and at least have the knowledge in our back pocket, right? And so that we can do something. Well, probably one of the most popular still, and rightly so. Talk about a work of absolute incredibility, but the King James. King James is definitely an option for today. You find it everywhere. You find it everywhere online, and so that was. Would you say the King James is word for word or paraphrase?
I don't think that's possible because not every language has every word that.
Oh, you're getting into a thing here. No, you're absolutely right. But that's the 2 extreme sides. That's just how they're labeled. So, what is your estimation of the King James? Where does it fit?
exactly in the spirit of the original text because of the time past and what we've learned.
Yeah, you're actually right. If we were in 1700s, it's about as word for word as you can get. As we learn more about the original languages and find more, as far as manuscripts and more witnesses, I like to call the manuscripts witnesses. That's just as a little personal thing in how I'm using that word, just to let you know. It's gone from being on that very edge of word for word, and it's slowly just moving back. And that's no fault of its own, okay? It's no fault of its own. Looking at the King James, again, it was a work of stellar academia. I mean, it was an amazing work for its time, but over 400 years, it's moving down the list. And Travis is 100% right. First of all, it was translated from the received text, the TR, the Textus Receptus, which is based on 25 manuscripts, and that ignores over 5,000 Greek manuscripts, not to mention the other ancient manuscripts that we have from different languages, the 25,000. And so that's an issue. That is a very real issue that if you're using the King James, you need to be made aware of. Because what we know from the comparison is that the King James probably has some scribal additions, some scribal notes that have been incorporated into the text that shouldn't be there. So there's some added verses in there. Not that it changes the meaning, but they're simply there. We need to know that they're there. And so you have the King James. That's one a lot of people like to use. And it's still a very good, strong translation, but you are going to have to deal with archaic language, which can cause issues. I'll give you an example. The archaic language. Does language change? Words change meanings? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But, you know, if we were in 1920s, and I say, Carl, you're such a gay fella. I would get a handshake and maybe a hug and everything. But in 2023 America, if I say, Morgan, you're such a gay fella, he's going to punch me in the nose. Right? Words change meanings. That's an extreme, but words change meanings. The 2 Thessalonians, Paul says to abstain from every appearance of evil in the King James. What does that mean? What does it mean to abstain from every appearance of evil? Anybody? We're going to have espresso and donuts before class if y'all are this quiet, man.
Just evil where it appears.
Here's how we normally teach it from the King James. Traditionally, we'll teach 2 Thessalonians 5:22 like this. Stay away from or avoid every appearance of evil. If it looks bad, you better not do it. 5:22, I think. 1 Thessalonians 5:22. Pretty sure it's 5:22, maybe 5:12. If you start in Thessalonians and just read, you'll find it, I guarantee you. But that's how we teach it. If it looks bad, don't do it. If someone might see you do something, even though you're not doing anything wrong, you better not do it. And you know how that's our exegesis of the passage, and you know how we've used the passage? It's traditionally been used throughout the majority of the 20th century to allow a preacher or an eldership or people in authority or maybe just a loudmouth to force his scruples on someone else. The word appearance is translated from a word that means form or shape. In 1780, the idea of appearance was how it appears not to someone else but to you. How we would say it today, you abstain from every form of evil. If you see that it's evil, you stay away from it. This isn't about what someone else might see you do. In fact, that interpretation and that exegesis violates 1 Corinthians 13. Because as a brother or sister in Christ, if I see you do something, I don't jump to the worst case scenario according to 1 Corinthians 13, because love believes all things. What does that mean? I'm going to believe the best of you until I have evidence, clear evidence, to the contrary. That means when I see you pulling the liter bottom down there, you're getting gas, not a six-pack. Do you see a difference there? Words change meanings. Words change meanings. And so that's an issue with the King James. And that's a real issue with the King James. But that doesn't mean the King James is unusable. Because the King James should be admired. Because that was a tremendous, tremendous work. So you have the King James. Well, what about the New King James? New King James, again, came out in the late 70s, gained steam in the late 80s finally, and they did a really, really good job. And again, it's considered a very accurate translation. It would be on the side of word for word. Is it all the way over? No. The biggest issue, it's based on the same Greek text. It's based on the Textus Receptus. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's ignoring all of these other manuscripts over there. It does a great job cleaning up the language, removing some of the archaic language, fixing some things, and modernizing the King James. Wonderful translation, very readable. In fact, the Barna Group, which is somewhere in Oklahoma, I think, the Barna Group every couple of years looks at all of the languages and has all these little computer thingies, and they give it a grade, an education grade of the educational level it's written for. King James, it's collegiate. Probably wasn't so 100 years ago. It is today, let me tell you. New King James, it's written on a 7th grade level. It's the most readable of our English translations that's considered over here on the accurate word-for-word side. So it's a great translation. It's a wonderful translation to use, but out of all the witnesses that we have, out of all the manuscripts we've discovered, it uses 25 because it's based on the Textus Receptus. So you take it as you will. So let's move past that. You have the King James and New King James, again, very, very accurate. But let's look at another one that's very, very popular. What about the NIV? What about the NIV? You get this question sometimes. NIV really gained fame in the 80s. Ended up being everywhere. And the NIV, we could accuse the NIV of really feeding into the King James only movement, because the King James people felt very threatened. And we don't like change, right? And here's something that's changing. I don't like that. Is it a bad translation? Not really. It has issues. But there's not going to be a translation out there that doesn't have issues. And so NIV, it's not a word for word. Not considered that. But it's also not considered a paraphrase. It doesn't have Jesus writing a John Deere, okay? It's not considered a paraphrase. In fact, the translators got together and they decided they were going to try something different. And they were going to make the perfect balance. And they called this, here's a technical term, a dynamic equivalence. Equivalence meaning equal, and dynamic meaning alive. So they're going to not do a word for word. They're not going to do a paraphrase. They're going to try to be in the middle of the seesaw, right? And so they're going to be as accurate as possible when they can. But when it gets confusing, they're going to go to readability. And so they understood the need for accuracy in that word-for-word translation, but at the same time, they put readability above it as their goal. And so as a result, you have a decent translation. And I know some people really love the NIV because, you know, when you go from the these and thous and the etheth, the ETHs is what I'm trying to say very poorly. to something that's very readable. People go, wow. But here's the problem with it. In an attempt to make people go, wow, and have it so readable, what they inadvertently did was, instead of translate, they began to interpret. And the group of translators were very Calvinistic in their studies. And so you have some issues with certain verses. And I'll give you some of the biases. Psalm 51:5, they translated as David saying he was sinful at birth. That's very Calvinistic leaning. It's Calvinism says that we inherit, even as infants, our sin from Adam and Eve. That's not a biblical doctrine. But they have David saying, I was sinful at birth. Romans, instead of flesh, they translate sarx, which means flesh, which means body, physical flesh. They translate it as sinful nature. And again, there's this Calvinistic leaning because we have a sinful nature because we're sinful from birth. So there's issues there. You have to deal with their translational bias or their doctrinal biases in this dynamic equivalency. But as we're walking through, we've gone from some word for word, and now we're kind of in the middle with the NIV, which wants a foot in both worlds. What about those who are paraphrases? You know, we talked about the cotton patchers. That's really an extreme, and again, that's not really a Bible. That's some blasphemous joke. But really, when I say paraphrase versions, what kind of versions pop into your mind? Anybody ever deal with a paraphrased version? Or what do you think in your mind? What would be a paraphrased version? There's some really popular ones out there.
With the Message Bible?
Mm-hmm. The Message is one. Anybody hear of the Message? No one's heard of the Message? That was extreme. That's even a bestseller for a while there. The New Living Translation, the NLT, that's considered a paraphrase. The Message, the Good News Translation, you'll see that a lot. That's considered a paraphrase. Contemporary English Version, paraphrase. Here's the issue with the paraphrase versions. They're very, very readable. I have a EPUB, which is an ebook copy of the Message. When you open up the Message and you read some of the Pauline epistles, it's like you just got a letter in the mail. It is the quickest read. You get the idea down. But you go to the Psalms, it's ridiculously done. The Sermon on the Mount doesn't even sound like the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, let me pull it up. One thing you got to love about an iPad, I got my entire library with me, so let me pull it up. And I'll just read from you. I'm going to read from you. Seriously, Wilda. Why do you let me get away with this poor English? I will read for you. Turn your Bible to Matthew 5. Let's go to Matthew chapter 5. Downloading. Here we are. Okay. Matthew chapter 5. I'll say this for the Message. When you're dealing... Seriously, you let me turn pages, but you're not letting me go to the table of contents. What is your deal? I'm turning pages right now going to Matthew because the table of contents won't come up. Because Apple is stupid. But it's still better than Windows. I'm in Acts now. I was in Romans when it came up, but now I'm in John. Are you going to work now? Nope. Okay. 15, 14, 13, 12. People at home are going, if anybody's watching at home, they're going, this guy is a moron. All right, Matthew chapter 5. All right, I'm just going to read the first 10 verses. It's the Beatitudes. We all know the Beatitudes is the blessed are. If you're, I had a teacher one time say, I love this. You know, in English, when we say blessed, we pronounce it blessed because it's 2023. And he would say when a student would read or quote and say blessed, he would say, you're not a Baptist preacher, stop it, it's blessed. And that always sticks in my head because the tendency is, again, we want to sound flowery, right? So we say blessed is. It's blessed. Anyway, okay. Beginning in verse 1. When Jesus saw his ministry drawing huge crowds, he climbed a hillside. Those who were apprenticed to him, the committed, climbed with him. Arriving at a quiet place, he sat down and taught his climbing companions. This is what he said. You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and his rule. You're blessed when you feel you've lost what is most dear to you. Only then you can be embraced by the one most dear to you. You're blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more, no less. That's the moment you find yourselves proud owners of everything that can be bought. You're blessed when you... okay. Do you see the problem with the paraphrase version? Okay. That's enough of that. That was even making me aggravated. All right. And so that's an issue. That's an issue. That's an issue. Man, I got 3 more versions. We're going to do this quickly. Okay, so again, what about the most modern? The 2 most prevalent right now, New American Standard, ESV. They are considered right now the most accurate. They're based on the latest Greek texts. They're constantly being updated. In fact, they're being updated about every year. You have 2 Greek texts out there that use all of our witnesses. One's called the Nestle and that's the one I use. They're up to version 28, came out last year, the NA 28. You also have the, I'm blanking. You have the Nestle and, the NA, and there's another Greek text. Okay, we're out of time, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but there's 2 basic ones. The NA 28 is probably more commonly used. The New American Standard, the ESV is based on it. What's the difference of the 2? Okay, if you ask me, ESV. I use ESV almost 100% now, unless I'm comparing something or doing a word study, because the ESV matches exactly the Greek text that I use. 100%. And to me, it's extremely readable. It's like you're picking up something that was written yesterday. And extremely accurate. If you ask Eva, New American Standard. It's extremely readable to her. To me, it sounds stilted. And here's where the issue is. The English Standard Version, it's written like we talk here in America with American grammar. The ironic thing, the New American Standard Version is written more like British English. And the reason is because of word order. Greeks, they were loosey-goosey, man. I mean, they put nouns at the end of the subjects, at the end of the sentence, verbs at the beginning. Their word order was based on emphasis. What are they emphasizing in the sentence? And that came first. All right? And so you might have a clause down 3 verses down that Paul uses that's referring back to a noun up here, loosey-goosey. And the New American Standard wants to keep the word order as much as possible while still being readable. And so that makes it sound a little stilted. A little bit, just doesn't flow right to my ear. That's my personal thing. And maybe if I was a Brit with a cup of tea and with my pinky sticking out and drinking my Earl Grey with the Queen, I may think it sounds wonderful. But I'm not, and so it sounds weird to me. ESV, man, I can fly through it and it sounds just perfectly readable to my American colonial tongue ear.
Sentence structure in different languages is different. And,
Mm-hmm.
and yes, based on the languages that
That's
you
yeah.
originate from, that matters.
It does. It matters. And that goes back into translation theory. What are you going to do? Readability. You can't give a King James Bible to someone who's not a native English speaker. It's not going to work.
It's very hard to read.
It's not going to work. It's not. Yeah, it's just you don't do it. And we don't think about that necessarily. You've got to think, who is the audience? Who is the one going to be studying from it? What are they going to be doing with it? Who is going to be reading it? And so you want one that's very, very easy to read. And right now, we are blessed to have two very accurate translations that are very, very readable to a modern audience, and that's the New American Standard and the ESV. They're all good. If you're studying and trying to get down and dirty with the text, use more than one Bible is what I would say. But if you're just wanting one to read casually, that takes in all of the 5,000 witnesses and not just the 25, those are the two I would suggest. But ultimately, we've got to be comfortable with it. But all these background pieces, that's what they are. They're just background pieces. And with that knowledge, you remember the old NBC thing? And the star would come up, the more you know. That's the whole point of it. The more you know. Because there's differences in the way they translate between the versions. And we say, well, why? Well, the background gives us a lot of those pieces of the puzzle. But the whole point of all of this is we can know what we have. And whether we're using a King James, New King James, not the cotton patch, and you can see not the paraphrased message, but if we're using an accurate translation, and there are many out there, we can be pretty well assured that right now we're closer to those original lost manuscripts than we ever have been. And we don't need to doubt. We don't need to doubt. Okay. I kept y'all 10 over, but in my defense, Steve dragged those songs. No, I'm kidding.